Chapter 9, Lesson 2, Fighting for Independence. What to know? What were some of the important early events of the Revolutionary War? Identify the early battles, campaigns, and turning points. Examine the roles of American and British leaders. Describe how individuals and other nations contributed to the war's outcome. Words to learn and practice in Quizlet. Enlist, mercenary, campaign, turning point, negotiate. People, Marquis de Lafayette, Benedict Arnold, Friedrich von Steuben. Fighting for independence. You are there. The soldiers are starving, says the Marquis de Lafayette. They eat nothing but fire cake made of flour and water. As you and the other soldiers listen, your stomach rumbles. It's been days since you've had anything but fire cake to eat. Since Congress won't send help, General George Washington says, I'll order the local farmers to sell us their crops. The air outside is bitterly cold. But you don't care. Let's go, you yell. We're finally going to get food. The Marquis de Lafayette helped the Continental Army. And here's an interesting pictographic. A British soldier and an American soldier. British, red coat, American. Let's look for these components. Number 1, British red coat. 2, musket with bayonet. 3, haversack for food. 4, tricorn hat. 5, musket with bayonet. 6, cartridge bag with sling. What equipment did the British soldier and the Patriot soldier both carry? Comparing armies. In July 1775, George Washington arrived in Massachusetts to meet the Continental Army. The soldiers wore no uniforms, only their everyday clothes. Many had no guns, so they carried spears and axes. Some had fought in the French and Indian War, but most had no military experience. Many were farmers who had just enlisted or signed up for duty in the army. Washington was once so frustrated that he threw his hat on the ground and shouted, "Are these the men with which I am to defend America?" Keeping the army fed and clothed took huge amounts of supplies. Washington once estimated that his army needed 100,000 barrels of flour and 20 million pounds of meat a year. Congress could not raise enough money to pay for the food needed to feed all the soldiers. The Continental Army went to war against one of the most powerful armies in the world. The British Army was made up of professional soldiers with training and experience. The British had 50,000 soldiers in the colonies. 50,000, you guys. The British had 50,000 soldiers in the colonies. Washington usually had no more than 15,000 soldiers in his army at any one time. The British Army also had thousands of mercenaries. Mercenaries are hired soldiers. Because many of the mercenaries came from a German region called Hesse-Cassel, Americans called them Hessians. But the British had problems too. It was difficult to fight a war more than 3,000 miles from home. Loyalists offered some aid, but the British soldiers still had to wait a long time for supplies and soldiers to replace them. Reading check. What geographical problem caused difficulties for the British Army? Yeah, that would be the Atlantic Ocean. Washington led the attack across the Delaware River and into New Jersey. It's a famous painting. Early battles in the North. By the spring of 1776, Washington and his army had moved south from Massachusetts to New York. They were camped on Long Island when British troops attacked them, outnumbered 4-1. The Americans suffered great losses at the Battle of Long Island. The British Army then decided to chase Washington and what was left of his army. Many soldiers had left after the Battle of Long Island. It's called desertion. Many soldiers had deserted after the Battle of Long Island, and Washington had to persuade the others to stay. He and the soldiers who stayed with him did their best to avoid capture by the British. By winter, they had marched through New Jersey to Pennsylvania. British General William Howe and most of the British Army were in New York for the winter. When Washington learned that the Hessian mercenaries stationed at Trenton, New Jersey, were not prepared for an attack, he decided to move against them. On Christmas night, 1776, Washington and his army crossed the icy Delaware River in boats. The troops then marched 9 miles to reach Trenton. There they found the German troops sleeping after spending the day celebrating Christmas. The Americans attacked, and the fighting lasted only an hour before the Hessians surrendered. This victory gave the American soldiers hope for the future. Reading check. Why did Washington decide to attack Trenton on Christmas night? An important victory. In 1777, the British Army planned a new campaign. A campaign is a series of military operations carried out for a certain goal. The goal of the British was to capture New York so they could separate the 13 colonies and cut off their communications and supplies. They also wanted to use New York City's harbor to land more soldiers and supplies. The British campaign called for several large groups of soldiers to travel to Albany, New York, to join troops led by British General John Burgoyne. Together, they would attack the city from the north, west, and south. North, south, and west. This plan might have worked, but the British troops never reached Albany to help Burgoyne. They were delayed by smaller battles along the way. On September 9th, 1777, Continental forces surrounded General Burgoyne's army near the town of Saratoga. New York. Burgoyne and his soldiers could not break through the Americans' lines and had to pull back. The Battle of Saratoga was really 2 battles that took place over 3 weeks. During the second main part of the battle, the American commander, Benedict Arnold, led a group of soldiers in a daring attack. Although Arnold was wounded badly in the leg, his attack succeeded. As the battle continued, the Americans captured British cannons and supplies. Finally, on October 17, Burgoyne surrendered. The British surrender at Saratoga was a turning point in the war. A turning point is an event that causes an important change. Suddenly, it looked as if the Americans might have a chance to win the war. Reading check. Why was the American victory at Saratoga a turning point in the war? Surrounded in the Battle of Saratoga, British General John Burgoyne had to surrender to American General Horatio Gates. Winter at Valley Forge. In the fall of 1777, the Continental Army once faced trouble. While trying to keep the British from taking Philadelphia, the Continental Army lost a battle at nearby Brandywine. In late September, British soldiers captured Philadelphia, where they prepared to spend the winter in comfort. Stunned and exhausted, the weary Continental soldiers retreated to nearby Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. Washington chose this location because he wanted to keep watch on the British in Philadelphia. He wanted to keep watch on them. The Continental Army that set up camp at Valley Forge was a ragged group. Congress did not have the money to send supplies. Most of the soldiers wore clothing they had brought from home, but it had become torn and burned from the soldiers' battles. Some of the men had walked so far that their shoes were falling apart. One young Connecticut soldier wrote that he had not a scrap of either shoes or stockings to my feet or legs. He and others wrapped their feet in rags. Since food was also running low, Washington allowed his soldiers to buy food from farmers around Valley Forge with Continental money from Congress. Also, New York Governor George Clinton sent barrels of salted pork. Additional help came from the 20-year-old Marquis de Lafayette, who traveled all the way from France to join the Continental Army. Lafayette later described himself as having an American heart. Washington liked the young Frenchman and immediately gave him important duties. Lafayette spent his own money to buy warm clothes for the soldiers he commanded. He was so generous that they began calling him the soldier's friend. Life at Valley Forge improved further when Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben arrived. Von Steuben was a German soldier who had decided to help the Americans by training them to become a skilled fighting force. He taught them how to attack and retreat faster and how to use weapons more effectively. By the spring of 1778, Washington's soldiers had become an organized army. Reading check. What effect did Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben have on the Continental Army? What effect did he have? Contributions from other nations. Actually, let's go back. We didn't get to look at this. Washington, on the White Horse, and his army marched to Valley Forge, Pennsylvania in 1777. Contributions from other nations. While the war raged on in North America, Benjamin Franklin was in France, negotiating with the French government. To negotiate is to try to come to an agreement that is acceptable to all the parties involved. Franklin asked the French for supplies and soldiers. He argued that France would benefit from helping defeat its old enemy, Britain. At first, the French offered little help, thinking that Britain would win the war. Then, news of the American victory at Saratoga reached France, and the French agreed to support the Americans. Other nations also offered to help. In 1781, bankers in the Netherlands gave a large loan to Congress. Russian leaders, through the League of Armed Neutrality, worked to keep the British from blocking trade with the Americans. Bernardo de Galvez, the governor of Spanish Louisiana, gave guns, food, and money to the Continental Army. Later, he led his own soldiers to capture several British forts. Spanish-born Jorge Farragut fought in the Continental Army and Navy. And here is Jorge Farragut, who was 21 years old when he came from Spain to fight for the Americans in 1776. He later became an officer in the United States Navy. Reading check. What caused the French to join the war in support of the Americans? In summary, the Continental Army was less experienced than the British Army. However, the Americans had some important early victories at Trenton and Saratoga. Other nations helped the Patriot cause. What were some of the important early events of the Revolutionary War? Who led the Americans' negotiations with France? Why was Valley Forge's relative location important to George Washington? What was it close to? And what were some of the costs and benefits of joining the Continental Army? Fernando de Galvez. Fernando de Galvez was born in Malaga, Spain in 1746. Galvez first came to North America in 1762. He traveled with his uncle, who was visiting New Spain. In 1776, he returned to lead a Spanish regiment in Louisiana. 1 year later, Galvez became the governor of Spanish Louisiana. During the Revolutionary War, Galvez chose to help the Americans. He protected New Orleans against British attack, which gave him control of the Mississippi River. Galvez let American ships use the river to move weapons and food to Patriot forces fighting on the frontier. In 1779, Spain declared war on Britain. Galvez captured the British towns of Baton Rouge, Natchez, and Mobile. In 1781, he captured Pensacola. By the time the war ended, Galvez and his army controlled all of West Florida. After the war, the new United States Congress thanked Fernando de Galvez for his help during the American Revolution. Here we see on pages 386 and 387 an example of scale, map scale. Here's the Battle of Long Island with our Patriot troops and our British troops. Now look at the scale of the next map. You can see how you can see more details the closer in you get.